Hello, this episode of Language Therapy is an only audio episode. I just wanted to share that although we've transitioned the podcast to video, we recorded this episode prior to the transition, and it was so wonderful and so thoughtful that we decided to release it anyway. So please enjoy, and we will be back with a video episode at the end of July. Hello and welcome to another episode of Language Therapy with Dr. K, a podcast from the USC Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies. My guest today is David Ghoogasian, or for many, simply Mr. David, an educator, psychologist, and the current head of school at AGBU Manoogian-Demirdjian in Los Angeles. But this episode isn't just about education. It's about language as memory, legacy, and identity. David grew up in California surrounded by a rich and complex linguistic palette, including Eastern Armenian, Western Armenian, the Artvin dialect, Russian, and of course, English. As it turns out, he's one of the very few speakers of the dialect of Artvin, a variety of Armenian that has not been spoken on its native soil in over a century. In our conversation, David reflects on what it meant to grow up with this linguistic inheritance, and how his relationship with dialect shifted from private family space to public linguistic documentation. We talk about dialect shame, the moment he froze as a child between two linguistic words, and the emotional legacy of literacy passed down through generations. We also delve into David's philosophy as an educator, how Armenian schools today navigate linguistic diversity, what it means to teach a language that carries centuries of trauma and pride, and how children internalize messages about what kinds of Armenian count. Drawing from his training in neuroscience and cognitive psychology, David helps us understand why some people can fluidly shift between languages, accents, and dialects, and what this reveals about language learning, identity formation, and social belonging. Finally, we explore broader questions about language ideologies and community dynamics, the perceived hierarchy between Eastern and Western Armenian, the silent assumptions behind dialect choice, and the ways in which language, even in the form of a greeting or a single word, indexes entire worldviews. This is an episode about embodiment, linguistic vulnerability, and the power of language to shape who we are and how we remember. Join us for this deeply personal and intellectually rich conversation. David Ghoogasian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, Shashan.
Where were you born? And more importantly, what languages or varieties of language were you born into?
So I was born in California, and I have to probably go a little bit farther back to say that my father was born in Detroit, and both his parents were born in the Ottoman Empire. Sepastia, paternal grandfather, Evereg, paternal grandmother. Without giving all the details, one arrived in the U.S. at 12, my grandfather, 12 years old, and my grandmother at 9, so they were already here in the 1920s. My mother's father was born in Artvin, which was then Russian Empire, and grandmother was born in Novorossiysk, Russia, where my mother was born, and my mother was one of the DPs. She also was in the U.S. by 9 years old, so around 5 years old, they left Germany, taken by the German troops, and planted in Stuttgart, Germany, and by 9 years old, she was in the U.S.
As a displaced person.
And so I was born into this, and my grandparents on my mother's side spoke the dialect of Artvin at home. And this is what I learned, the dialect of Artvin. And through that, of course, Eastern Armenian, and then, of course, English. And father's side of the family lived in Michigan, so I had contact with them once a year, twice a year. And then I attended Mesrobian School from 4 years old to 17, kindergarten through 12th, where I learned a lifer, where I learned Western Armenian. So it's been an interesting journey. And with the exception of my mother's mother, none of my grandparents were read and wrote Armenian fluently. So she was, because at her time, during her time, born in 1918 in Novorosisk, they still had Armenian schools. So she actually graduated Armenian school. So she was very literate.
And what, as a young child in this very dynamic linguistic environment, what was your evaluation of the value of literacy?
I believe I've shared this with you a very long time ago. So I remember coming to my grandmother's house after school one day, and there was an elderly lady, older than my grandmother, and as I entered the house, she was kissing my grandmother's hand and exited. So I looked at my grandmother and I said, "What was that all about?" And she said, "I found her sister through writing letters and reading letters that came back and forth." She said, "She's not literate." And so I wrote these letters for her, and I read the letters we received, and she had not known of her sister since World War II, and we found her. So there I saw the power of literacy and the language, and beyond just saying, let's preserve the language, that it has utility in life.
I think those types of experiences can be so formative for a person, for especially a young, impressionable person, to see the pragmatic value of something. What was the Artvin dialect like? What does it sound like? What did it feel like? Were you aware? I guess, when did you become aware you are a speaker of a dialect?
So very interestingly, so mother's side of the family spoke the dialect of Artvin. And so my mother was born in the Soviet Union. Her brother was born in the Soviet Union. Her third and fourth siblings, brothers, were born in Germany. One came as a toddler to the U.S., one as an infant, and my youngest aunt was born in the U.S. So at home, they spoke the dialect of Artvin. They didn't attend Armenian school. There were no Armenian schools.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather's and grandmother's rule was, even though they were fluent in Russian, that you speak Armenian in the home. But the Armenian they spoke was the dialect of Artvin. So I grew up speaking it very naturally, very normally. And then I went to Armenian school, and I learned that there are words like lolik.
Tomato, the proper word for
the
tomato.
Proper word for tomato.
What did you say at home?
So they used the Russian pomidor. We would say naski, socks. But then the dialect of Artvin itself, I would hear, for example, Sayat Nova being sang and thought, I understand some of this. And so I may have shared this with you many years ago. The first time where I felt like I froze was I had forgotten something in my classroom, and I must have been about 6 or 7 years old.
So this is at Mesrobian Armenian School,
yes.
where the standard of instruction is Western Armenian.
And now I am in the presence of my aunt and my kindergarten teacher, who was from Beirut, Lebanon, and spoke Western Armenian and taught Western Armenian. And I wanted to ask if she had the key, and I froze, because in my mind I said, if I say it this way, she's going to think it's awkward. If I say it this way, she's going to think it's awkward. So there's panali, and the Artvinsi, the word in the dialect of Artvin is balink. It's not even banali, it's balink.
With the plural k.
Yeah, balink. And so I kind of froze, and I think I wound up saying it in a soft Western Armenian. I don't recall. I just remember that emotion of not knowing how to say it, because you've mentioned this in your podcast as well. There's dialect shaming, right?
Yes.
So later, again, it was very natural to me to speak the dialect of Artvin, and then of course, grandmother passed away, grandfather passed away. I would speak it with my mom, my great aunt. And then one day at a colloquium at UCLA, I met Bert Vox, and we became friends because of this, by the way. So
Bert Vox is a very well-known linguist who works on Armenian, among other things.
Yes. And so very casually, I told him I speak the dialect of Artvin, and he kind of was dumbfounded for a moment. He said, "Excuse me?" And then he said, "You're an historical anomaly." And I said, "I had never thought of that before." He said, "You're speaking a language that has not been spoken on its soil in over 100 years. And when I thought about it, what was very natural to me, it suddenly occurred to me that I know 2 other people of my generation who can speak it. And they don't speak it as I'm not being immodest, but they don't speak it as well as I do. So he said, "Will you work with me to document this language?" And to me, that was such an honor and a tribute to my grandparents, and just to be able to work on it. And then he gave a talk on it at Sorbonne University.
It's amazing.
And we made some interesting discoveries, because you now think about it from an academic perspective as opposed to just conversational.
Can you share some of those findings or discoveries?
Sure. So the dialect of Tiflis, right? They'll say, for example, Chimgidi, I don't know. So the dialect of Artvin, we say Chemgidi, but what I discovered just from speaking with him was when the chem is terminal, it becomes chim. So, so we would say, this is one that I shared with him, Onchichimen Khabar Chim. I don't know anything about it. Onchinch, Onchichimen, from nothing, Khabar Chim. I have no information on this.
Wow.
And so there was a quandary as to, is this a Western or Eastern dialect? And it has features of both. And it's a Lis dialect. So there's Khosumem, there's Ghosim, and there's Khoselisim. So it's a Khoselisim I'm speaking.
Wow.
Another interesting aspect of it was that how certain Garapar roots, classical Armenian roots, have been retained. So in standard Eastern Armenian, you say Sira, Nara, Dara.
Aya.
Standard Western Armenian, you say Asor, Anor, Ador. In the dialect of Artvin, you say Sama, Nama, Dama.
Wow.
So it's retained that.
Yes.
It's kind of a linguistic enclave that just remained that way. And I think for me, it was maybe the perfect storm, because I have no siblings. I had no cousins in my area that were my age, so I hung out with the older people. And my grandfather didn't speak or read. I mean, he didn't read or write Armenian. And his standard Eastern Armenian was okay, but I spoke the dialect. And therefore, it wasn't affected by other forms of Armenian. So it became a very natural thing for me to speak it.
What did you make of standard Western Armenian when you started school? I'm just curious. You said you started at age 5?
4.
Or even younger, 4.
And of course, I heard Western Armenian from my father's family as well, yes.
Right. But did Western Armenian become the kind of formal variety in this 4-year-old's child? Like, this is the one we write down.
Yes. Even though I knew there was Eastern, and I did speak Eastern.
Yes.
But for me, that was the formal learning of Armenian was done through Western Armenian. And of course, I would go home, and the Rusahai family, they would make comments.
Like what?
Or gor, they would not understand gor. And I to this day, I don't use gor. It's not stigmatized. I speak kind of more formally.
Yes.
But even my English is more formal. Like, I don't say I'm going to go fishing. Right? My English is that way too. So I don't use so much of the colloquial, either Eastern or Western Armenian. I can.
Right.
But
you don't.
I generally don't.
That's not the default.
And my English is that way too.
Interesting. I have to think about that one. Yeah. And what did your Mesropian teachers make of your linguistic repertoire?
So I think I fit in pretty quickly. I think I learned it pretty quickly. And I remember, so you know the word saat, time. So there were one or two occasions where I slipped and I asked Sat Kanye. But I said Sat. Artvinsis don't say Saat, they say Sat. So the adult said Nerugutun, and I repeated it. And that's where I learned the word sag, which is fee. He thought I was asking the fee for lunch. So he answered, and that's how I learned what sag meant.
Wow.
But I knew it was a mistake, like the second time. Not a mistake, but it was not the right place to use that word. So it's been a very real journey.
Yes.
Linguistic journey for me.
I guess one could say an embodied one.
Yes. And so the dialect of Artvin, I became much more free about it after working with Bert on it. It was like, wow, this has value.
Yes.
It has tremendous value. And he asked for some teasers to present at Sorbonne University. So I said, okay, I'll say one that I don't think people would understand, which is Hekuts matamat vagoroch yamumut ertam.
I caught ekuts.
Ekuts, but I think to say hekuts, matamat, arabot, vagoroch early, yamuma, jam. Artvinsis pronounce the j as ya, jam, yamuma, dertam. Tomorrow, early morning, I'm going to church.
Amazing.
So it's something that one wouldn't understand.
But it's interesting, and we talked about this a couple of episodes ago on the one on Baskahayat and how important it is to document these dialects because right or wrong, that validation means something. And I mean right or wrong that we need or seek that validation, not right or wrong in terms of is the dialect right or wrong or proper.
Yes.
I guess that kind of academic documentation and validation does offer some kind of a sense of this is important. This goes beyond me and my grandparents and this intimate environment.
Definitely. And had a wonderful, wonderful teacher. She wasn't my teacher, but she was a teacher when I was a student, and later when I became principal, we worked together. And she always used to say, she was from Haleb, but Sasunsi roots. She would say, Miak panavor manatsere aramada hayastanen lezune. The only thing left from Western Armenia is our language, and we must not only preserve it, but and she would say that classical Armenian gave birth to twins, Eastern Armenian and Western Armenian. And she said, Eastern Armenian seems to be healthy. Western Armenian doesn't. So it just needs a little more attention. Not giving, she says, not that one is correct and one is incorrect or one is better or worse. It just one needs some attention while the other seems to be doing okay.
I think that's a great analogy to parents deciding which child to focus on based on where that child is in their life. Yeah. I'm going to use that and steal that, by the way, just so you know. What about Russian? What role did Russian play in your family dynamic?
So both grandparents were fluent in Russian. And, because of that, I understand Russian. I understand better than I speak. And because of that, let me say a little bit about my background as well.
Sure.
I studied psychology, but after that, I studied the learning and teaching applications of neuroscience and cognitive science, which is a very specific niche. So it fascinates me, first of all, from a neurological perspective, as well as a social, psychological, educational, communicative perspective. So, every language leaves its signature, right? So when people speak English, if they're from Iran, in Farsi, there's a sound that is between a k and a ch. Like they say, I can't. So they speak English, and you could tell they're from Iran. I can't. Or in Hindi, the ta, 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 the different teeth. So you know where they're from. So because of that, even though Russian was spoken in the house, mostly to keep secrets, right? They code switched often. So I knew my mother was speaking to one of her first cousins when she mixed English and Artvin and Russian in the same sentence, and it would just flow that way. But because of that, I started to notice, and this is not judgmental whatsoever, it's just like every language leaves its signature, how generally people from Armenia have a very strong accent when they speak Russian. So even though they speak Russian better than I do, generally,
Yes.
the accent I pick up on very. So for example, like a hairdo in Russian is prichoska. It's a o, prichoska. People from Armenia say parechoska.
Or yeah.
Yeah. Or vapshe, antanrapes. Usually, people from Armenia will say vapshe. Yeah.
And the mягкий знак.
Yes.
They won't do the palatalization.
Yes. And the addition of the mягкий знак with words that end with tune, like nerohutsyun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nerohutsyun.
Yes. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And Russian Armenians have the Russian la, for example. Like they'll say bolorovin, bolorovin, or, and they also have the or.
Or they'll do the Russian trilled R on, like Russian Armenians used to call my father Araik instead of Araik. All the R's become a trilled R.
Yes,
yes. But, Armenian has the two R's. It's so fascinating. And this is something I mention to my students all the time, that an accent is a reflection of usually the first phonetic system you acquired and your imposition of that phonetic system on a new language.
Yes.
It's never a reflection of your skills, of your proficiency, of your command of the language. It simply tells the person who's listening to you that, hey, I was exposed to another phonetic system.
Yes.
Because people have so many complexes about accents, and so many families will make language policy decisions at home precisely out of fear of their children potentially having accents.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of need for education and setting the facts straight about this.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I'm continuously fascinated by them. So sometimes when I'm working with Armenians, whether they're educators or not, I'll ask them to say hello. So if you hear typically barevzes, usually from Armenia, parev, usually from Lebanon or Syria, usually, bariev from Russia, barev from Tehran. So that one word can tell you so many things. Yeah, and that's what the brain does. The brain categorizes. So you can't know, for example, every dog in the world, but you can say pit bulls are like this and poodles are like this. Even though the gentlest dog might be a pit bull, you have to categorize. So you make assumptions also on socioeconomic status. You make assumptions on education when it may have nothing to do with it.
Yes.
And it's the same everywhere. The U.S., you talk like this, and you may have a doctorate, but they assume, right?
Or the perception by Americans that if someone speaks with a British accent, they're an intellectual, or they must be some elevated,
Yes.
It's funny, we were even having this discussion in the office the other day, if phenotypically, just by seeing someone, we categorize what type of Armenian they are.
Yes.
And some team members were arguing that, yes, with pretty high accuracy, one can categorize.
Definitely. When I would drive my grandfather places, mother's father, he would say, Armянskaya pachotka, hai kailvatsk. This is an Armenian gait. And he'd be right. It's the way that they walk. He would say, this is an Armenian walk. And he was right.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So how did you decide to study psychology and neuroscience, and how did that lead you to a lifetime in education?
So psychology was very interesting to me. It encompasses so many things: science, art, people. There's math because of statistics. There's science because you're learning about the brain and how it works. There's social aspects of it. The study of, let's say, neuroscience and cognitive science applied to education was more informal training because it didn't exist at the time. That field formally didn't exist. And I entered the field of education quite by accident, actually. It was absolutely, my intent was not to go into the field of education, but literally what happened was I had received my degree in psychology. My fiancée, who is now my wife, who is also a Mesrobian graduate, was working at Mesrobian. The principal said, Nairi, the teacher who was supposed to show up on Monday or whatever the first day of school is, just called and said, she's not coming. Can you please ask David if he could just come fill in? It was like the day before school was going to start, I think. And she said, please, you ask him. Like, this is not his intention. So I remember it was 1987, and I said, until you find somebody, 4 words that changed the course of my life. And I fell in love with it, and then later became counselor, then an acting principal, then a principal, and then currently head of school at AGBU.
So the first time I was introduced to you, you were introduced as the first American-born principal of an Armenian Day School. And I believe that's accurate. But I guess what's more important is, why weren't there American-born principals? Why was that such a phenomenal thing that it preceded my actual meeting of you?
So what I've been told is I'm the first principal of an American Armenian school who is a graduate of an American Armenian school. I think there must have been, obviously, principals in public schools that were of Armenian descent.
But of an Armenian Day
school, yes.
Right.
So Armenian education in the U.S. has about a 60-year history. So obviously there's that aspect of it, like until you create generations of people who are somehow, I don't want to use the word molded, but influenced by that education. And as I said, I always saw tremendous value in the language from so many perspectives. Interested, you were talking about dialects and Garabhar, classical Armenian. This is like the genetics. It's the DNA. It's where does it come from? Where do you trace this from? And then, of course, I married somebody who was born in San Francisco, but whose parents are from Musadag. So now there's this whole other dialect that I was exposed to. So I'm very interested in Armenian dialects. For example, in the dialect of Musadag, inchka chiga, like what is and what isn't, like what's going on. Chagu chigu, inchka chiga. I believe it's zeytun, if I'm not mistaken. They say choko chokoshko, inchka inchchiga. I think Artvinsis just say inchka chiga. But what I'm saying is there are so many different ways to say the same thing, and they come from these rich linguistic backgrounds, these enclaves that, because of the circumstances of the time, they didn't mix.
But I think on top of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this may be a stereotype, typically the picture is the following. Yes, Armenian Day Schools only have a 60-year-old history, so the first schools, I think, were opened in the 1960s, right? That first generation of educators and administrators typically were Armenians from the Middle East.
Correct.
Who were following this type of legacy of community schools. And then there came a point where, and they had very strong Armenian proficiency.
Yes.
And weren't necessarily educators.
Correct.
And I think now the dynamic has changed. Now we have American-born leaders in Armenian Day Schools who have very impressive degrees in education and school administration. Some are graduates of the day school system, but just casually, when I've interacted with them, many are self-conscious about their Armenian proficiency. And I think in that regard, too, you're very exceptional.
Oh, no. Thank you.
And again, this isn't judgment on either side. Exceptional really in the true meaning, singular, in that not only do you have very strong command of Armenian, but this fluidity and your ability to comfortably embody the two standards, the dialects, and so on, even the way you do impressions is, I want to ask you from a brain angle, how are some people very good at languages and accents and this kind of versatility, and some aren't? Is that how does science explain it?
Well, I mean, the way I like to put it, not that I made this up, but the genes are like the building blocks, right? And the environment is like the foreman, right? It's how these things are put together. And so we know about epigenetics now, which the environment can turn off or turn on certain genes to express themselves or not. So it's a very, there's been this debate for centuries. Is it environment or is it nature? Is it nature or nurture? And to me, as far back as I could remember, it's been a kind of a silly question, because it's in most cases clearly both. It's a dance between nature and nurture. And obviously, for example, it's ridiculous for me to say if I exercise and eat right, I'm going to be 6'4", blonde hair and blue eyes. No, those are, genetically predetermined. But then you have wiggle room within there. So, I believe we're born with a certain temperament, with certain propensities, and then our environment can kick in. And we all know that, whether it's personality or whether it's affinity towards something, or, the environment plays a very, very important role, but there has to be obviously some genetic complement there.
But I guess your example makes me feel even more compelled to tell people, families, that it's an amazing thing to expose your children to languages that you may deem insufficient or not prestigious. Look at what it did for you, and look at the reverberations of that, whether it's helping document this anomaly, whether it's your own estimation and evaluation of your linguistic heritage, whether it's the bonds that were formed and sustained through this particular dialect, whether it's your ability to transcend so many of the intracommunal boundaries. I often hear, again, anecdotally, families making decisions and omitting certain parts of themselves, certain parts of their heritage, because they are afraid of stigmas, of, setting their children back, or even their children being teased.
Yes.
This is something I hear a lot. I guess, what would you say to those families?
Know that there is a, beyond even the language, there's a worldview that comes with that language. There's, many years ago, when I was principal of Mesrab, and I was principal twice in the 90s, the LA Times did a feature on the school. And I remember saying then that I don't understand how somebody cannot speak the language of his or her grandmother. Like, you've lost a connection to a whole world when you do that. So I was always very close to the elders in my family, and I listened to them, and I learned from them. And, in the case of my grandparents, my paternal grandmother, as I said, she was in the U.S. by 9. She never graduated high school. My grandfather was 12. He never graduated high school. My grandfather received his GED and my grandmother her high school diploma the year I did, 1982. They decided they were going to do it. Mother's mother did graduate high school. Mother's father lost his father when my grandfather was 9, and he had to help raise his family. But they were all wise. They all had so much wisdom. They all have had such a strong place in my formation as a human being. And I don't think I would have been the same without them.
And that wisdom would not have been transferred had you not had a shared code.
Yes, yes, definitely. And even how that is a doorway to other languages. So, for example, one of the things in working with Bert Vox, we were finding words that are borrowed, right? So where Artvin is located, it makes perfect sense. There are Russian words, there are Turkish words, there are Georgian words, there are Persian words.
Yes.
So Artvin sees round out all vowel sounds. So like kör in Turkish becomes kor. Kosha becomes kosha. So there are no like those blended vowel sounds. Musadag is the opposite. They have like, Bert had written an article called The 40 Vowels of Musadag. And Artvin said and keeps the very basic vowel sounds. But for example, so here's where my background in the brain and learning and psychology came together so amazingly. So Bert was interviewing me. I think back then it was before WhatsApp. I forgot what it was called.
Skype?
Skype, yeah.
Yes.
It was on Skype, and he was about to leave for Sorbonne to give his talk on the dialect of Artvin. So he was asking me a few questions, and he said, "Do you know the word tomari?" And I said, "No, it doesn't sound familiar." And then we got off. And this was not a spiritual experience. It was a memory experience. I heard the word in my grandfather's voice. Tomari havake, amena havake, bolora havake. Pick up all of it. So I emailed him. I said, yes, it's not a word that I normally use, but tomari means all of it. And here's the context. And it was fascinating because that in memory is called episodic memory. It's a memory of an episode in my life. It's not necessarily an academic kind of memory, but it's something that happened in time and space and got stamped in my memory. And I literally, in my head, it was in his voice. And I said, of course, I know what that word means. And then there are words that sound very strange, but they come from Georgian. So Artvinsis don't say lind for gums, they say ghrdzil. They don't say bear. I mean, they don't say arch for bear. They say datu. They don't say gandag or kantak. They say bulti, which is Georgian. They call girls gogo. And so there are these other things too. For example, the imperative. How would you say sit? You're telling somebody to sit.
Nastir.
Nastir, right? So Artvinsis either say nastits or nist, which nist in standard Armenian is a session.
Yes.
So they say nist, teritra nist, sit in your place, or nastits.
But it makes perfect sense because Artvin changed hands in a period between the Ottoman Empire and Russian Empire multiple times. And also there's a Georgian past. There's, I guess, the language documents all of that history.
It does. So, for example, Persian reng, color, Artvinsis say reng. It just rounded. Vacht, which many Eastern Armenians, Jamanak.
Yes.
Yeah, so really it's a door into an understanding of not just the language itself, but the history and the culture.
That it carries with it.
Yeah, the imprint left by centuries, over the centuries.
I want to ask about your role as an educator. And again, I'll start with how you were introduced to me and my perceptions. Up until I met you, my stereotype, I guess I'll say, because we all stereotyped. I'm not saying it proudly, but I'm saying it as a matter of fact. Of an Armenian Day School principal was a Western Armenian speaker from the Middle East, most likely male, most likely an engineer or a doctor or something like that. And, we moved here in the 90s. There were a lot of Eastern Armenians coming, but the community organizations were really led by Western Armenian speakers. And whenever I was tapped to join one, I was the only often Eastern Armenian speaker. And I was very self-conscious I thought that to be serious, to be taken seriously, to be taken into account, I needed to speak or use Western Armenian. And I remember the first time you and I were on a committee together, and I think you turned to me and said something silly, probably, in Eastern Armenian, and I was shocked because you were a male Western Armenian speaker, seemingly to me, principal of an Armenian Day School. I didn't know you were born in the U.S. And then when you spoke Eastern Armenian, you really shattered a lot of both the stereotypes, but also my own insecurities at that time as an Eastern Armenian speaker wanting to be taken seriously.
Oh, wow.
And then I wonder what that must do for both your faculty at the schools you lead and also for your student body. I know right now the number and status of Eastern Armenian speakers has changed from the story I just shared. But I do have, in some of the research I've done, the experience of Eastern Armenian speakers in Armenian Day Schools when this wasn't the case and the struggles. So I guess the question is, how does your very unique linguistic profile impact your interactions with those you lead at the schools you lead? But also, and I don't know if people share with you how it must impact their own aspirations or their own assessment of their own linguistic background.
Well, first of all, thank you. You've had a tremendous influence on me too. We hit it off immediately from the moment we met. In many, many ways.
Yes.
So interestingly, because as you pointed out earlier, my formal study of Armenian was Western Armenian, I would speak for many years exclusively Western Armenian. And one day I told myself, why? Why am I speaking Western Armenian to somebody from Armenia or from Iran in this school setting? And I will never forget, I'm speaking Eastern Armenian with a parent from Armenia, and another parent from Armenia walks by and stops. And he looked at me, and he looked at the person I was speaking with, and he goes,
He speaks like us.
He speaks like us. And it was like a light turned on. And I'll never forget this because there are so many, there's a value system that is attributed and hangs with these linguistic traditions, right? So the principal of the ARS, Armenian Relief Society, Saturday School, for many years, who is from Armenia, they taught Eastern Armenian with Reform orthography. And I'll never forget this. And by the way, I promise you this is not to be self-serving. It was an eye-opener for me. She said to me, because she sent her daughter to Mesropian afterwards. And she said, and by the way, I don't like using the word Beirutsi Hayastansi, but she says, she's Hayast from Armenia. She says, Hima Hayastansinere hangist եմ զգում այստեղ ղրկելու իրենց երեխեքին։ Այդպես չէր առաջ.
Yeah.
So
now
I thought,
Armenians
wow,
from Armenia feel
feel
comfortable
sending them to the school. I also don't easily accept when one or the other says, I don't understand that Armenian.
I don't either.
I understand if it was Bulgarian and Swahili.
Yes.
But these are two varieties of Armenian, and it takes the tiniest effort.
And the disposition to be open to accepting this as a variant of your language.
Yes. And so what I started doing was, in public settings, somebody speaks to me in Eastern, or I know they're Eastern, I speak Eastern. If they're Western speakers, I speak Western. And I say, there's nothing wrong, nothing wrong with it. It's beautiful. Absolutely. And you need to know it. And for many years, Armenian was considered this museum piece that needed to be preserved and protected. And I say, no, Armenian has to thrive. It has to be a living language where these students not only learn things by heart and they have to create in the language. And in many cases, it happens. A lot of things still happen very traditionally in Armenian schools. I'm not speaking about one particular Armenian school, but a lot of wonderful things have been happening and a lot of changes. And I have to say, your work in heritage language has made a huge impact I remember the first time hearing you say this and resonating and saying, oh my gosh, yes. So you have these Rusahai kids at a Western Armenian school, and they say samalyot, and they say voch, adi Ruserene, otanav, or in Armenian, they often say inknatir. But say, oh, inch lav Ruseren nelgides. You have hayrena, I say. Right. You don't stigmatize it. You don't embarrass them.
Well, because I think the particular example I had witnessed was doll or purse or something. The teacher held up a doll, and one of the students said kukla, right? The word in Russian. And when the teacher said no, immediately my thought was, but this child learned it from her mother or her caretaker. So the moment you say no, that's wrong. Now the child is concerned about the status of whoever taught it. So,
yes.
Do you think your personality shifts when you shift between Eastern and Western?
Well, I'm not sure about personality, but they each hold really a worldview. And some things that, in any language where there's a culture obviously represented, something that's funny in one won't be funny in another, right? Yes. And there are just ways of saying things. And so this is very funny. So there's a security guard from Armenia, and he worked with a security guard from Lebanon. And he's telling me this. He goes, I don't understand what this man is saying. So he says, one day I come to work, he says, Amposh kisher chem bargats, which in Western Armenian is, the entire night I have not slept. So barkel in Eastern Armenian is to literally lie down. So he goes, bavonses kanel.
How did you sleep?
How did you sleep if you didn't lie down? So it went back and forth. He says, did you sleep in a chair? He says, no. Did you sleep standing up? He says, no. Then how did you sleep? And he said it took about several minutes when they finally figured out that it doesn't mean the same thing. Barkel and bargil is not the same thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's actually humorous when you see the humor in it, instead of laughing or saying this is wrong. There's humor in it. It's beautiful.
And it's funny because most of my close friends in the U.S. have been Western Armenian speakers, and we've transcended beyond most of the differences except humor. I know there are jokes I can't share with them because the language play, the linguistic elements sometimes don't line up, but more importantly, the sociocultural references aren't the same.
Yes, exactly.
So that's sometimes when I want to tell a joke, I literally in my mind will have to be Hayastansi friend who also knows Russian. That's the appropriate audience for this particular joke. How do your students relate to you, and how aware are they of your fluency and fluidity in all the Armenians?
So they became aware once I started using it, and I started openly saying it. And, in schools because I've worked in a consultative basis with all the Armenian schools, except for the one in Fresno, just because I haven't, not on purpose. So in the schools that teach exclusively Western, they of course teach Eastern, like literature, poetry, and all of this. But I always would emphasize, if they speak Eastern, let them write in Eastern Armenian. Not only is it okay, it's wonderful for the Western Armenians to hear it and for them to develop it, but for them also to learn the other branch of the language. So they did become aware. And in fact, right now I have a student, I'm so proud, I was telling him how I'm interested in classical Armenian. And he serves on the altar in church, born in the U.S. He started teaching himself Garapar and writing. And I said, please send me what you've written. And obviously there are some errors, but it follows the pattern of the Lamentations. So I called Jesse Arlen.
Yes.
And I said, I have this student. And this high school student is now studying Garapar, classical Armenian, with Jesse online. It's you want to, if they have that interest, you want to spark it.
Yes.
And give wing to it. Not say, why it's a dead language. No, it's a beautiful language. And it has a place. It has a place. And in fact, this may be controversial, I don't know, but people speak about how the Batarak, the liturgy, is not accessible. So I still think, this is my opinion, it's not the correct opinion, there isn't, but I like that it is in classical Armenian, and you can have a translation up or so people know what's being said. But there's something about hearing it in classical Armenian that makes it different, because a Vishap, a dragon, 1,000 years ago is not our same understanding of a dragon today. Like, it could mean evil. But when you're saying you fought dragons, you're not really fighting dragons, right? But again, it tells you something about, history and theology and culture, right?
And also, I have to agree with you. And I know that many people won't share our opinion, but I think there are particular associations with languages and particular traditions or rites or even religious, like the value Arabic has in Islam or the value Hebrew has in Judaism. I think it's the same with classical Armenian for the Armenian liturgy.
Yes.
And I think there is I don't want to say divinity, but there is something about that language that is associated with that particular tradition that it transcends just comprehension. It's not about comprehension.
Right.
It's about the engagement with that text, and that text needs to be in its original form, I guess. I don't know.
Yes.
And my opinion of this has evolved over the years, I have to say, to coming to the fact that, yes, it should be heard and spoken in classical Armenian, and that should be okay. It's okay not to understand all of it. The goal isn't to understand verbatim. The goal is to take part in what is happening.
And that's not to say that the church should not engage with the youth. Those are two different things.
I agree. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, and when I read the confessional, for example, I will do it exclusively in Garapat, in classical.
Yes.
And I tell the students what I'm reading. This is what we're saying.
Yes.
But this is how you say it. This is how it was written. This is how it's been passed down.
Yes.
So my wife's father was a priest. Her grandfather was a priest. And I mean, there definitely is something to be said about that. And truly, after the fall of the last kingdom of Armenia, the church was the gatekeeper of the culture and even politically.
Even the community, communal life.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. What is, as head of school, I guess, for multiple schools now at AGBU, what is your philosophy or your vision for language at your school?
So once again, obviously we're in the United States. So there was a time early on in Armenian schools in the US where they would say, don't speak English. Well, that's not going to happen.
No.
That's not going to happen. You're in the United States. You're going to speak English.
You need to speak English.
You need to speak English, or you remain in your bubble. Right? Right. So one does not preclude the other. You can know Armenian extremely well, and you can know English extremely well, and one will complement the other.
As you do.
Yeah, no, thank you.
No, really. But really, I think that's also important because we fail to speak about your English proficiency. I think the other thing your students and faculty must see is the sophisticated man who is equally sophisticated in English and in all the Armenians. I'm not saying even education, consultancy, the brain, and all of it, because, again, this is a domain where my opinions have evolved. Role models are important, whether we take them seriously or not, but children need role models, and they are so smart and so observant.
Yes.
You don't need to say things. You just need to behave, and children will deduce from your behavior.
And I speak about this with educators all the time, that it's beyond what you say, it's what you do. What you do speaks much more loudly to them than what you say.
Sorry, I interrupted. You were talking about English and the importance of English.
So, a lot of times early on, and even I know from my wife's family, one generation above, they said when they went from Musadak to Anjar, they started teaching standard Western Armenian, and they would get demerits if they spoke the dialect until they realized, no, this is something that has to be preserved. Like they would literally get a negative consequence for speaking the dialect of Musadagh because they didn't want them to sound provincial and all, right? So even in the 1970s here, there was a movement, right? A lot of the people who were survivors of the genocide were Turkish speaking.
Yes.
It doesn't make them bad people. This was their, right? So there was a movement, I think it started in Lebanon, Türkeren Khosogin Hayren Badaskhane, answer in Armenian to those who speak Turkish. And so Turkish was also stigmatized, but it's important to know Turkish, right?
It's also, for many people, the language of their parents or grandparents.
Yes.
So the moment you stigmatize that language, you are creating a wedge between these familial relationships.
Yes. And if you really want to understand, you have to know.
Yes.
You want to know the language and what they're saying.
Yes.
And for years, there was this talk in the United States of the U.S. being a melting pot. And I've always viewed it as a mosaic, not a melting pot, where Armenians are beautiful stones in this mosaic. So they're part of this big mosaic. They're not necessarily, the term that is used now is whitewashed, right? That you lose all of your ethnicity. You don't. And I know how I feel. I feel that I walk extremely comfortably in the Armenian and American world. I feel zero awkwardness in either place. And I would love for my students to experience that. And, when we have Armenian that is taught at an honors level and it's UC certified. So now you're not just saying learn Armenian because you have to, because it's the language of our ancestors. Yes, but it also has utility. You're learning honors level language, right? Like my son Aram bypassed his foreign language requirement at UCLA because Dr. Cowie tested him and he went through all the levels of Armenian because he had an Armenian education.
Right.
So put aside all of the culture, put aside the guilt, like you have to know it. If you don't know it,
you're a bad Armenian.
You're a bad Armenian. There's utility to it, right? And now in the US, people are paid stipends for knowing Armenian, right?
Yes. And just this week, so what is it, Monday today, on Wednesday, there's a language fair here at the USC campus where the Institute will have a table where we will demonstrate how we use all of the languages and the linguistic repertoires of all of our staff members.
When is this?
Wednesday.
Oh.
Wednesday on this campus.
Okay. That's beautiful.
As you walked in, we had several students working on Institute projects. One of them is transcribing an oral history in Armenian. One of them is cataloging all of our books, many in Armenian. The other is helping me produce a special podcast series of this podcast that will be in Armenian with linguist Heraç Martirosyan.
Wow.
All three of them were hired because of their high proficiency in Armenian.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And I think we don't... it's not that we don't appreciate it, it's that we don't underscore or highlight the instrumental value of Armenian. And it's not either or. It's not just the cultural heritage, burden, guilt, or the instrumental. And I would even add a third category, which is just, Jakob Kulujan will say this, self-realization.
Yes.
Doing something beautiful.
Yes.
Spending your time doing something that inspires you.
Absolutely.
It could be part of your cultural heritage, and perhaps it's not. Maybe it's Japanese that does it for you. But if it's classical Armenian, like the example you gave, why not? I think we've become so production-oriented and so focused on pragmatism. Sometimes we also forget, leisure and beauty and self-realization. I think that's important too. And sometimes we forget to give that as an option to our students, and some of them may grab it.
Yeah, 100%.
When offered.
Yeah, no, and it's beautiful, as you said. So I'm not, dismissing either the pragmatic side or the cultural side. What I'm saying is it's multifaceted.
Yes.
It's including learning something for the sake of learning it, the
Yes.
beauty of it, as you said.
Yes.
Yeah.
A couple weeks ago, I was a jury member for the AEF oratorical competition, so the Armenian Educational Foundation. And there were students from many of the local Armenian Day Schools giving speeches in Eastern Armenian, Western Armenian, English. And it was such an emotional experience to see these young people, almost all of whom were born here, willingly sign up
Yes.
to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of us in the audience shared this special moment. And I just, on my drive home, I kept thinking, what an investment as a community that we value the language and the culture and the heritage so much that we go to the trouble to organize events like this for our
Yes.
students to showcase. And there were students from your school that you lead now. And I had a lovely chat with some of your teachers. But maybe in conclusion, you could give us a picture of what is the linguistic dynamic at AGBU now? What does it feel like? What do you hear in the halls? What do you hear in the playground? What do you hear in the classroom? What about the teacher's lounge? What does language sound and feel like?
So I'm not going to say that it is unique to AGBU, but in our Armenian schools, right?
Okay.
So some interesting dynamics. So there are a few schools that teach both standards of Armenian, and there are some that teach Western. Interestingly, one of the things that I always try to emphasize is that we shouldn't build an artificial barrier between the two. So we've been talking about, at the very least, exposure.
Yes.
For Eastern Armenians to Western Armenian and Western to Eastern, so that they don't say we don't understand it, right? And this happens quite often where, because you're put here, these are the others. And that's another thing the brain does. There's an inside, there's an outside, right? So there's my family, and there are people outside of my family. There are people from California and people not from California.
There are people who speak like me, and there are those who don't
speak like me. So to kind of ameliorate that phenomenon where you just say we are Armenian speakers, and I happen to speak this kind of Armenian, but it's Armenian. It's Armenian.
But it's such this point, I would like to kind of hammer in artificial barriers. I think that's so important to break those barriers.
And in some schools, so for example, at Mesraben, Western is taught, but Eastern literature, Eastern Armenian students speak Eastern Armenian, and they're allowed to write in Eastern Armenian if that's what they choose. But the point being that it's one. It's was it George Bernard Shaw who said the English and the Americans are two people separated by a common language, right?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Yes.
And that's kind of what it is. And I was speaking with a historian, I don't want to mention names, an historian from Germany, a German, who once commented to me, he said Western and Eastern Armenians are almost fundamentally different people who don't even tolerate one another very well. And this was his non-Armenian perspective, just kind of working. And you hear it. Even if you don't say it because it's now politically incorrect to say, there's an undertone that these people are like this and these people are like this. And there's an automatic, and again, going back to the brain categorizes, right? And it does this naturally and quickly and automatically. And when it does it with people too quickly, we call it prejudice. And it's something that the brain does, categorizes. So you're kind of fighting against that as well, that people who have this shape of eyes are these kind of people, and people who have this accent or are this color or dress this way are these kind of people. I'll never forget, I had a student once who was undergoing chemotherapy and shaved his head before his hair fell out. And the boys in his class decided they were going to shave their heads in solidarity. We had a new parent come and asked me if we allow skinheads in the school. And I very gently told him, what was actually happening, and he felt so badly because you want to make
Right.
a conclusion about
Right.
this. You want to see this person and say, I don't even not if it's not conscious. You don't say, I want to think
Right.
of you this way. It happens.
But how does one intervene? What interventions help us maybe reflect
Mhm.
on that automatic categorization?
So to bring it into consciousness, it doesn't mean it's going to go away. We have cognitive biases that
Right.
affect all of us, but to bring it to people's attention, number one, and then to put examples before. So there was an event at school at AGBU last year, and they asked me to speak, and I said, let somebody else speak. And the person who spoke was born in the US. One side of the family is from Lebanon, one side from Armenia. He speaks both fluently, and he spoke in both dialects. And he said there is no correct or incorrect Armenian. And when I just went there, I said, I'm not saying this about this place, but when you have schools that teach the two standards of Armenian, there is often an artificial barrier that's created.
Yes.
Let's do something about that, right? So I wasn't saying that's a phenomenon here. I'm saying it's a general phenomenon. It's an us and a them phenomenon, right? But again, the brain, we were talking about barevziz or parev or barev, right? Or bariev, right? So even, people from Istanbul, right? And this is something I think we've talked about. In my experience, at least, the only ones who pronounce the double L are Bulgarahais, Bulgarian Armenians, and Armenians from Turkey.
Yes.
Like Western Armenian speakers will say Bidi Allah. Turkish Armenians say Bidi Allah. Bidi Allah.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So you know something about probably where they came from or where they learned their language, right? So it's fascinating. It shouldn't be eliminated and painted over.
Yes.
It's beautiful. It's rich.
Yeah, and I know on that committee that we served on, we talked about this, that, okay, for literacy, let's say, it makes sense to divide the kids into Eastern and Western. There's orthographic differences, morphological differences, but they could be in the same drama class.
Yes.
They should be doing a play together. They should be, and so on, for them then to create new uses, new us groups that now involve different language varieties and so on. So I think that's amazing. Okay, final question. I know I said there was a final question before, but what do you think the next couple of decades looks like for Armenian day schools in the U.S.?
Again, a very, very, very good question. When the first schools were established in 64 and 65, it was an experiment. It was something that had been done in various places in the world, in diaspora. And there was, my understanding, was a lot of trepidation at that point. Like, how is this going to happen? Who's going to, who's going to go there? And are they going to really learn Armenian? And is it a lesser quality school? So as time evolved and parents became more entrenched in the American culture and more American educated and started to see that, there's more to education than this. It's not just let's learn Armenian and send them there. They would say, Misa tsezi voskora mezi, the Armadais would say the flesh belongs to you, the bones belong to us. Like, do whatever you want. So the Armenian schools began to evolve as quality institutions in the standard sense of education and have an Armenian quality to them, right? So it's not one or the other, it's both. You can have a quality education and you can be Armenian, whatever that means, right? And our schools have produced just amazing graduates. Like I'm not going to mention any schools in particular, but a world-renowned professor of veterinary medicine, liver transplant person, people who are involved in politics.
In the arts.
In the arts, absolutely, absolutely.
I just experienced a DJ at age 42, first time, who apparently has this incredible underground following, who's an Armenian Day School graduate, and what makes him stand out is his infusion of Armenian themes into his electronic music.
Amazing. Yeah, and it's in every realm
Yes.
of society. And you don't lose your Armenianness by doing something in American society, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't. It's not, again, they're not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
They can walk hand in hand, and they result in a much richer experience for you and for those you interact with.
Yes.
Yeah.
What question should I have asked that I didn't ask?
Wow. This was a very natural conversation.
I know.
Yeah.
I
We
know.
talk like this. I really, I don't know if there was a question that you didn't ask. This to me was a dialogue
I know.
more than an interview. It's, and that's to your amazing credit. I truly, truly love and admire the work that you do.
Thank you.
And again, I'm not saying this to flatter you, but there are not many people who have the intellect and the character and the passion and the interpersonal skills. When those come together, it's magical. And I love the work that you and your group are doing here. It's transformational.
Thank you so much for your words and also for your time today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Language Therapy with Dr. Shushan Garbatian, a podcast series from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. This episode was produced by Dr. Garbatian, edited by Samvel Krajan, who also composed the original music. For more from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, visit the Institute's website at armenian.usc.edu and follow the Institute on all social media platforms.